Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Stringer here talking to you again. Um, we were talking about the impact of the war on drugs this week. So hopefully you've already read Chapter 9 of your textbook, and I'm just going to kind of go through the high points of that and elaborate on a few things and give you kind of my commentary and thoughts on this. Um, we've kind of touched on some of the impact of some of the different policies throughout the class as well, so you might notice a few things are kind of similar. One of the things I want you all to do too is watch this TED Talk by Ethan Nadelmann. He's one of the big drug experts in the country, and he gives a pretty good TED Talk on kind of a lot of the consequences and the harms that have come from the drug war itself. And so I think that's a good supplemental video for you to watch if we were teaching this. I was teaching it as a face-to-face course. We'd show it in class, but obviously we are not in that format if you are watching this video, or maybe we are and you're just watching this because you didn't go to class this week. Either way, so check that out. Give you a little bit of background, and he's a pretty knowledgeable guy on this kind of stuff. So just to kind of look at overall the impact of the war on drugs, the prison population increased about 600% between 1977 and 2012, which is just crazy. And if you think about it, 1977, a few years after that, we started getting into 1980 and, the 80s, where we started kind of the big crack epidemic and the drug war really got started, or at least the current drug war, so to speak. The percentage of state prisoners incarcerated for drugs quadrupled. Federal prisoners obviously went up too. In 2010, 52% of the inmates and 17% of state inmates were incarcerated for drug offenses. I think I mentioned that earlier in the class that most people in federal prison are there for drugs. So that's a lot of our tax dollars being spent on that. Anyway, so one of the big assumptions is that a lot of these mass incarceration policies will deter people from using drugs and things like that. To some extent, I think it might deter people from selling drugs, and it might deter some people, obviously, from using them as well. But as we've kind of talked about, probably doesn't have a whole lot of effect on people who are addicted to drugs. They're not really thinking as much as a rational person would in order for that deterrence to have as much effect. Did a little bit of research on that, so I won't bore you all with that because that could take an entire lecture. Anyway, so this is just a kind of a chart that I like to show students to look at. This is federal prisoners by offense in '08. And most of the time we think about criminals, right? We think about these big violent, robbers and murderers, rapists and stuff like that. You see that, a bigger percentage than the immigration and the property and the other offenses, but still it's nowhere near as big as the drug offenses. So you can see that there, illustrates that pretty clearly. Another thing, important goal has been to reduce the use of illicit drugs, right? And President Obama kind of outlined some strategies for doing that, and he calls for a balanced public health and public safety approach rather than just, police and courts and prisons to kind of try to balance that out. And so here's some interesting statistics here also, looking at marijuana use over time. As you'll see, this starts in 1975. It goes through 2010, so it's a little dated, but you can kind of see how use actually declined for quite some time there, but it's actually been going up. And so it went up for a while here, then it started to go down a little bit in the early 2000s, but then it is kind of around 2006, hit a low point there, and then it's kind of started to go up since then. And since I've looked at it recently, it's been kind of doing that on that same trajectory. Since then, a lot of this has to do with different public sentiments towards marijuana use in more recent decades, right? People are also using it more so for medical use. Cocaine it kind of went up a bit in the the 80s, but it's kind of been pretty flat since then. So that's an interesting thing to think about too, right? But if you look at it, people might say, well, marijuana use went down in the 80s, and that was because of the big, drug epidemic, and they were really cracking down on it. Well, if you think about it, it really kind of started going down in the late 70s. Before that, already, the crack and cocaine, big drug war start. The stuff didn't really start till '85, uh, and so then it actually went up a little bit from the year before. But if you think about it, in the '70s, there's a lot more marijuana use going on, and then it kind of started to decline a little bit in the early '80s. And you see it hit the point in '92. This is one thing that I like to talk about with students, because oftentimes what you'll have is you'll have a trend, be it in drug use, crime, whatever. We can talk about it with regard to policing in New York City, and the crime trend or the drug use trend will already be going down, and the politicians will say, well, we're going to enact this policy, so we're going to start this drug war, or we're going to enact this zero tolerance policing policy, and then they'll talk about, in the media, how, oh yeah, well, crime has gone down way since then, and or drug use has gone down way since then, and I want you all to at least take this away from this lecture, is that if it's going down already and it's already on a negative trend like it is here, then you can't really say that, oh, because we started this new policy, that this is the cause of it going down, even though the politicians oftentimes will take credit for it. But you all, being educated criminal justice students, you will know that, hey, it was going down first. Now, if it wasn't going down first, if it was going up, say maybe it was here and they started a new policy here, and then it changed the trajectory, and then started to go down, then maybe I would consider giving the politician credit for it. But oftentimes you see this stuff is going down already, and so that's one of the big criticisms of mass incarceration, right? Is because the crime trend in the country was going down before we started mass incarceration. But we say, oh, well, we incarcerated all these people and the crime went down. It's like, yeah, but the crime was going down before you started all that. So it's not really a strong argument there, but the media doesn't tell you that side of it, right? So anyway, one thing I like to talk about too is the amount of money that we spend on the war on drugs. So in 1971, we spent about 100 billion, or 100 million, sorry. Yeah, millions, right? Yeah, thousands. Yeah. So 100 million in 1971, and then I don't even know what this is. Maybe 15 billion, 15.6 billion dollars. And this is in 2011, and you can see, I mean, it's gone up steadily pretty much since then. And most of this is being spent on enforcement, right? Very few people are getting any kind of public health, mental health services, and things like that. But the drug addiction is being spent mostly on, arrests and prosecution and incarcerations of people. For those of you that don't know it, on average, it costs, last I checked, about $30,000 per year per inmate to incarcerate them, and that's with giving them bologna sandwiches and very cheap food. As you think about it, these big, huge prisons, there's a lot of money that it costs to keep them up to date and keep staffed and all that kind of stuff. So it's not just in feeding the person. Anyway, so the impact on the prison population has obviously gone up considerably. Some people, the 1973 Advisory Commission recommended that no new adult prisons be built, and advocated for closing some juvenile facilities. Obviously, that did not happen. So we've seen a lot of new ones since then. Incarceration rates. So for most of the 20th century, we've had about 110 people incarcerated per 100,000 of the population. But starting in 2007 through the current period, we have about 751 people per 100,000. So the land of the free is kind of the home of the incarcerated as well. So take that for what you will. So it really started to go up, like I said, during this period. And as I kind of said before, imprisonment binge is not really due to an increase in crime. It's more so an increase in enforcement of crime. Uh, Most of the self-report stuff shows that the crime trend, especially the violent crime trend, has been declining for quite some time. Um, anyway, here's one thing that I like showing students too, and it's a good kind of graphic to show you how the war on drugs has kind of impacted, mass incarceration in the United States. And if you look at it, so this part here is all the incarceration rates per millions, and the millions of people incarcerated, so to speak, right? And if you look at it down here, it's pretty low, right? But then Nixon declares drug use public enemy number one, right about here in the late 70s. And then you have about 501 incarcerated, 501,000 incarcerated Americans. We have about 41,000 incarcerated for drug offenses. So that, and you think about that, the percentage too of 41,000 out of 501,000 is a much lower percentage, right? So that's an interesting thing to say too. And then you declare the war on drugs around here, and then that's when this 41,000 starts to climb and goes up. And it already kind of started to climb under Nixon a little bit, but not nearly as steep of a slope as you see after that. And then you see the mandatory minimum sentences for drugs, and it just continues to go. 3 strikes and the truth in sentencing laws, and it continues to go up until you get to about 2010, where you see about 501,000 people incarcerated for drug offense out of 2.3 million. So this is about a quarter of the people in the country. Remember, I said most of the people in federal prison are there for drug offenses, but it's not the majority in state prison. I think, what did I say, it was 17%. So that's why it's not the majority of people in this overall graphic. But I think this shows kind of over time, and it helps to illustrate that, how it's impacted our ever-growing rates. So if you look at this is prisoners incarcerated for drug offenses too, kind of over time, and you can kind of see the difference in state versus federal. You see that federal kind of went up, but not as steep as the states did. The states really just went zoom, and started incarcerating a whole lot more people, even though they're still not, is the same percentage as in federal prisons. And a lot of that is due to the fact that if you put all 50 states together, there's just a lot more people incarcerated in all 50 states than there is in the one federal system, right? And so that's important to note as well. A couple of studies that I'll just mention briefly, talked about in your book. And so Frank Zemmering says that increases from 3 different patterns and 3 different time periods have actually caused these things. There's different increases in incarceration rate. David Garland talks about the changes in sentencing policies have caused the increase in prison population. Hopefully you all learned a little bit about the changes in sentencing policies last week as we covered that. And then Mark Maurer, Mark Maurer is another big drug researcher too, especially when it comes to sentencing. He works for the Sentencing Project and has published numerous things about this. And he says that sentencing changes impacted the prison population more than any increase in crime rates. So it wasn't the crime rates, it was the sentencing policies. And you probably heard me talk about the sentencing policies in some detail in the last lecture and textbooks, so I won't bore you all with that too much. Looking at, drug and offender imprisonment rates, this has obviously gone up. I'm not going to be too redundant to tell you all that. There's a few percentage statistics about how it's increased much more than it had, pre-1980. And I think I've kind of told you all how 1980s is when all of this really kind of got off the ground and started. And looking at the average time served, I think is another important part of this, because if you think about arresting more people, sentencing them to prison more, but you're also giving them longer sentences. So as it doubled from the average sentence being from 14 to 24 months, that also leads to a big increase in that slope there, right? And that number of people incarcerated towards the back end of those graphs that we looked at. Looking at the characteristics of the imprisoned drug offenders, I think I've talked about before how very few people are what's known as these drug kingpins. Most of them are low-level nonviolent offenders. And so Savini and John Calkins, they use data from '97 to look at this, and they find that most federal and state drug offenders were incarcerated for drug trafficking or for possession with intent to sell. And so the majority incarcerated for crack or powder cocaine offenses. That's not a big surprise. And most did not have a violent criminal record. And so this is 36% of federal and 21% of state offenders were actual first-time offenders as well. And so these weren't your big, repeat offenders, people that were out there, selling drugs for their entire lives. They were first-time offenders. Looking at kind of the Human Rights Watch report and their findings for race and imprisonment, these probably will not come as a huge surprise to you, unfortunately, but you'll see that, prison admissions for blacks and whites is very different, and black Americans accounted for 62.6% of all drug offenders in state prisons in '96. This has not changed a lot since then. And the rate of drug admissions to state prison for black men was 13 times greater than that for white men. And then the drug offenders accounted for 38% of all black admissions, but only 24% of white prison admissions. So I think my mouse is dying here. That's not good. Okay, we're back alive. All right. So some critics say that this isn't evidence of racial discrimination. You take that as you will. I would say that, these numbers don't necessarily mean that it's discrimination, but they do strongly suggest it. If I wanted to go and prove that this was discrimination, you'd need a little bit more evidence to make a more convincing case. But it does create some reasonable suspicion about that, right? Certainly, that you could use to dig a little bit further into it if you were interested in that sort of thing. Gender and imprisonment for drug offenses. Now, this is a little bit different because most of the time you see more males incarcerated than females. But as you see, the number of women in state prisons grew by 757%, but the males only grew by 388%. And so some people have kind of called this an unannounced war on women. And a lot of this has to do with these determinate sentencing policies as well that we've talked about last week with sentencing. Because without determinate sentencing and mandatory minimums, it used to be that women might be given a more lenient sentence, especially if they had children and things like that to take care of. But as you saw last class with this sentencing guidelines, that has absolutely nothing to do with it. And so when they started implementing these sentencing guidelines, a lot more women were getting prison sentences and longer prison sentences than they would have before, than the judge would have given them. So it did increase, the number of women in prison exponentially. 1 in every 3 women in prison is serving time for a drug offense. 25% of women inmates are incarcerated for drug offenses in 2010, and probably a little surprise to you that women of color are disproportionately incarcerated more than women of non-color. A focus on policing. So the New York murder mystery, I think it's talked about in your textbook, the unexplained drop in homicides between New York City in 1990 through 1998 and fell by 92%. And I already kind of talked about this, that, the chief at the time said, oh, well, it's all these new policing strategies, and it's really the fact that, most of the crime is on its way down anyway during this period. Some others believe that it could also be a decline in the crack cocaine market that, led to that crime drop. So that still is another explanation too. So I'll let you all think about all of that information. But I won't regurgitate what I already told you about it. So anyway, the effect on drug arrests the effect of drug arrests on crime rates. We've kind of already talked about arrests and crime and stuff like that. So I'm not going to get into too much detail there. But they mainly find that drug enforcement is positively associated with higher levels of violent and property crime, which is interesting. So it's not really reducing the drug property crime, the violent and property crime, so to speak, but it's increasing it. So the more drug enforcement you see, the more violent and property crime you see. So the big thing to take away from that is that it's probably not that the drug enforcement is causing the violent and property crime to go up. It's probably some third variable, such as drug use, is related to property and violent crime, and so the drug enforcement is a result of that. Also, with the broken windows theory, police would be more likely to engage in more drug enforcement if there was already a high violent and property crime, and so the causality could be backwards as well. And this is what I talked about, before when we were talking about the, the drug and crime relationship. That it's very complicated. So I'm not going to bore you all too much with the details of that. The effects of policing strategies to reduce illegal drug activities. There's a theory known as pulling levers. It's a strategy that has been implemented first in North Carolina, and it has shown some promise with regard to crime reduction. It's this idea that probation and parole officers work closely with law enforcement in order to be able to kind of crack down on these markets. Because if you have somebody who's out and they're on probation or parole, the probation and parole officers have a little bit more ability to go and check on them, so to speak, than the police do. The police need an actual, warrant or reason to go there, and the probation and parole people don't. So they can keep a little bit better tabs on people and enforce the drug laws a little bit stricter. Because they'll just both go to the place at the same time. And so looking at some other policies, hotspots policing, this is one that we tend to find some relatively good results for with crime in general and with drug crimes. And so the findings of Weisberg and Green reveal that the number of emergency calls or violent crimes really remained the same, but most disorder calls decreased in the experimental group. So in here, they didn't really see a whole lot of different effects. And this is very similar to the Kansas City patrol experiment, which you've probably learned about in your policing class. So I'm not going to bore you all with that if you've already heard about that. And then you had the Operation Safe Streets, which is a crackdown on drug hotspots in Philadelphia. And this didn't really have any impact on violent crime, murder, or even drug crime. And again, when you look at these policies, a lot of times these departments will say, we're going to crack down on drug crime in order to reduce the violent crime and the murder and stuff like that. And this assumes that the violent crime and the murder are a result of the drug usage, which you all now know that is not necessarily true all the time. And so when you create a big policy like that based on this assumption that might be partially true, but we know isn't completely true, then it makes sense that your results are not going to be exactly how you want them to be. So you really need to think through these things. And so that's hopefully something that you all will get from this class is, well, if we want to reduce violent crime and murder, maybe we should focus on the violent crime and murder and not so much on the drug crime. Because that linkage between the crime and the drugs is kind of questionable, right? Especially if you do something like this and you find that you don't have any results, or a significant impact, then you need to go back to the drawing board and say, well, maybe these two aren't as related here in Philadelphia right now. Maybe in some other situation they might be, but not here. So anyway, last thing I'm going to talk about is kind of the collateral consequences of the war on drugs. And so these are the things that happen to people that aren't really so much intended. So they're kind of collateral punishments and things like that that happen to people who are convicted of drug offenses, right? Most drug offenses are felonies. So after you're a convicted felon, you lose your right to vote. You can be denied public housing, welfare, things like that. And that's really hard for people to, when they get out of prison, they're convicted of a felony, to find somewhere to live. Because especially those of you who live around here know that pretty much anywhere you go, and this was not the case for me when I lived up north, where they would check your back, they want to run your background check just to rent a house or rent an apartment. And then if you have something on your record, I guess they tell you no. And so, that could be very difficult if you just imagine. And when you get out on parole, you have to have an address. So how do you deal with all of this? The other big thing is finding a job. When you're a convicted felon, you have to check that box on employment applications. And I always tell students, I think it's interesting because most of the time that box will ask you, or the question will say something about, have you ever been convicted of a drug offense? And I always think it's interesting because it never asks, have you ever raped, robbed, or murdered anyone? So apparently they don't really care if you're a murderer. They just want to make sure that you're not a drug user. So, this is the irony that we live in today. So think about that too, as one of these two big hurdles, right? To getting out of prison when maybe you got caught with a little bit of cocaine or something, and now you have a felony on your record, and now you got to find a place to live and a job. Driver's licenses could be impacted by this. You all probably know that student loans eligibility is related to drug offense convictions, right? And again, that application, the FAFSA, doesn't ask you if you've been convicted of rape, robbing, or murdering anyone. It asks you if you've been convicted of a drug offense. So the rapists, robbers, and murderers can get student loans while the drug offenders can't. And so, yeah. So think about that more too. Absent fathers, removal of mothers, and stuff like that. If you're taken away and put in prison for a little while, obviously the children that you have are not going to have their mother or father, or possibly both, for some time. And this can have a big effect on children, both during their childhood and their childhood development, and then later on, when they grow up. People that don't have the best home life when they're young tend to have very similar drug problems and crime problems when they get older. If you can imagine growing up in the foster care system or something like that, that could be pretty rough. So these are all this is just an overview of the things that, to think about what the impact of the war on drugs is having. So just to kind of summarize all of this, I put the dollar signs at the very top because I think that's like one of the most larger problems, right? Is the amount of our tax dollars that we're spending on this. In some states, particularly out west where they've legalized marijuana, they're saving a ton of money on enforcing these laws, but they're also making a ton of money by regulating marijuana sales and then taxing it. So instead of spending all these millions of dollars on marijuana enforcement, they're actually making money off of it, which seems like it would be great. And they're putting that money back into the community. They're using it for education and schools and roads and all of these other things to say, well, look, we don't really care if people go and smoke a little bit of weed, but we're going to tax you just the same way we do alcohol, right? Which, it sounds reasonable to me, right? Obviously, as we talked about, we've been arresting and incarcerating a ton of people. It doesn't really have, from what we see, a whole lot of effect on drug use, even especially with thinking about the cost-benefit analysis of what limited effect it might have on drug use, along with all the other stuff that's going on, it really seems to perpetuate inequality in many ways. And Michelle Alexander has a great book called The New Jim Crow, I think I mentioned earlier, where she kind of talks about how a lot of these drug laws are really made, to incarcerate people of color and perpetuate inequality. Um, and then looking at collateral consequences of crime that I just discussed, it's having a big impact, negative impact beyond just, being arrested and incarcerated, but it's having an impact after you get out, which then feeds into recidivism, right? If you have a hard time finding a place to live, finding a job, and things like that, and making a legitimate living, it can be very hard to not, go into crime and to not use drugs again once you get out. And, as I've talked about before, the punitive approach of just incarcerating someone and punishing them doesn't really help them with their addiction problems as well. So I've gone on for 34 or 31 minutes here, so I will let you all go. If you have any questions, obviously, about any of this stuff, let me know. I can talk for much longer about all of this, and those of you who had me face-to-face would know that. But anyway, I'll sign off for now, and I hope you all have a good day, and talk to you next time. Thanks.